Dawn on the heights above Adwa, March 1, 1896, the highlands above Adwa, northern Ethiopia, a jagged moon of rock and thorn rising out of the red dust. Before sunrise the world was a thin blue, and the men who stood on those slopes breathed cold air that tasted of smoke and coffee. You could hear the scrape of leather, the rattle of cartridge boxes, the hush that comes before a thing breaks. On one side of that hush stood a column of scarlet-trimmed helmets, polished brass, and horses reluctant in the mountains, the Italian army, confident in rifles, bayonets, and the doctrine of empire. On the other stood a sea of banners and flowing cloth, a thunder of hoof-beats and sandals, rifles slung, spears glinting, Menelik II's army, a nation called to arms. Emperor Menelik II rode like a king who had learned the language of both palace and battlefield, calm deliberate, his face framed by the nod of an old warrior and the soft iron of a ruler who had spent decades building alliances. At his side was Empress Teta, fierce and decisive. She had gathered warriors and servants. And at Adwa she was not merely a consort in a sedan chair, but a presence that moved through the ranks, issuing orders with a voice as sharp as any officer's whistle. Around them assembled the great captains of Ethiopia, Ras Makhonen, steely-eyed and stern. Ras Alula, who knew the mountain passes like the lines on his palms. Ras Mengesha and Tekel Haymanot, and other provincial rulers who had set aside feuds to answer Menelik's call. Their armies were a mixture of modern repeating rifles, tons of new Russian and European weapons Menelik had purchased, and ancient blades and lances. Their supply trains were enormous, the country itself feeding the columns with cattle carriers and a vast human tide. The Italians had expected conquest to be a business-like affair. General Oreste Baratieri, the Italian commander in Eritrea, had been prodded by Rome to act decisively. Italy's promises of prestige, its sketchy translation of the Treaty of Wuchali, and the swagger of a nation newly hungry for colonial glory had convinced many in Milan and Rome that Abyssinia would be another of Europe's acquisitions. Baratieri, practical, cautious, and uneasy with political pressure, nevertheless prepared to move. His force was smaller, trained regiments of Italian regulars intermingled with colonial troops, askari from Eritrea, with modern artillery that thundered like small storms. They had tents, medical wagons, and maps that convinced them the mountain gaps could be forced. What the Italians did not expect was the scale and speed of Menelik's response. In the months leading to Adwa, the emperor had quietly turned a series of parochial rulers into a national host. Messengers moved like vultures between provinces. Feasts and oaths were held, gunpowder was bought by the cartload. And whole contingents that had once fought one another were now folded into a single command. By the week of the battle, the Ethiopian host had swollen into an overwhelming body, tens of thousands by European reckoning, men who had come not for plunder, but for sovereignty. They had motive, they had grassroots logistics, and they had an intimate knowledge of the ground they would fight on. As dawn approached on that 1st of March, the Italian columns began to move into the broken ridges around Adwa. The morning light drew the hills with hard edges, then bled into the red dust as rifles cracked and horses reared. Small detachments of Italian infantry and colonial commanders, names that would be carved into both victory lists and memorials, pushed for vantage. Mist curled through ravines. The smell of spent powder hung under the eucalypts planted by earlier colonists. On the Ethiopian side, a chorus rose, war cries as much a practical signal as a spiritual one. Old men and young warriors, noble cavalry, and foot soldiers moved with a kind of studied chaos that hid a terrible discipline. Each unit had its role, each commander knew his ground. The empire Menelik had forged was not a single army in one formation, but a mosaic of coordinated blows, South African history online. By mid-morning the collision became inevitable. Scouts called warnings, officers snapped orders. The air filled with the metallic bark of rifles and the lower thud of mountain guns. For the Italians the plan had been to use their firepower and maneuver to break the Ethiopian host in detail. For Menelik and his captains the plan had been simpler and deadlier. Overwhelm, encircle, and refuse quarter to a column that underestimated them. In the space of that slope, in the dust and the hiss of spent cartridges in the faces of men on both sides, empires and nations were about to test a thesis. Could a European army armed with the latest Victorian weapons and the arrogance of empire crush an African nation that refused to kneel? The answer would not come from a proclamation in Rome, but from the first scream of a wounded horse and the last rallying cry on a hill lost and taken back, the clash of empires. By 7:30 a.m., the fog that had softened the Ethiopian highlands burned away, revealing a battlefield that looked less like a campaign map and more like chaos sculpted from smoke. General Barateria's forces, for brigades spread thin across ridges and ravines, realized too late that their maps had lied. The mountains were deceptive, the valleys deeper, the distances longer, and the enemy more numerous than Rome's reports had dared to suggest. The Italian brigades, led by Generals Aramondi, Debramida, Albertone, and Elena, had advanced separately, each believing the others were close. But Menelik's army, spread like a net across the highlands, watched from the heights. Rasulullah, master of mountain warfare, had predicted the Italians' path precisely. His scouts, barefoot and silent, guided columns of riflemen through goat paths and riverbeds. When the 1st Italian Brigade under General Albertone entered a narrow valley near Kidane Meret, they were swallowed by the terrain and by the waiting host of Rasulullah and Ras Mikhail. The first volleys echoed like rolling thunder. Albertone's Eritrean askari fought bravely, kneeling in disciplined ranks, returning fire with modern rifles. But their officers quickly saw the horizon darken, not with clouds, but with men. Tens of thousands of Ethiopians poured over the ridges, shouting, "Ethiopia shall never be colonized." And God and St. George, the Italians fired until their barrels glowed red. Ammunition boxes emptied faster than couriers could resupply them. Menelik II's command post was a small rise to the south, marked by a white tent and the imperial standard, a lion bearing the cross. The emperor sat astride his horse, observing through a brass telescope, issuing calm, measured orders to messengers who sprinted down the slopes. Beside him, Empress Teta had her own contingent, thousands of men from Semine and Yeju, positioned to block any Italian retreat. She ordered the heavy guns captured from earlier conflicts to open fire, their thunder shaking the valleys below. Meanwhile, General Debramida's brigade, moving to reinforce Albertone, stumbled into a trap. Ras Mikhail's troops appeared from the fog like phantoms, cutting off the Italian flank. The clash was brutal, bayonet against spear, rifle, butt against shield. For every Italian who fell, 3 Ethiopians surged forward, unrelenting. Some wielded ancient swords that had seen generations of war. Others carried modern rifles gifted by Russia or purchased through French traders. In the midst of the chaos, one Italian officer, Captain Carlo Galliano, rallied his men atop a hill, refusing to retreat. He waved his saber until an Ethiopian musket ball struck his chest. His men fought around his fallen body until they were overrun. The Ethiopian warriors paused only long enough to cover the dead with stones, a sign of respect for bravery, before continuing the assault downhill. By late morning, the rhythm of battle had changed. The disciplined lines of the Italian army had splintered into desperate clusters. The red dust of Adwa was thick with smoke, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the calls of trumpets and horns from every direction. The Ethiopians' war drums beat faster, signaling the advance of the reserves, tens of thousands of men who had not yet fired a shot. Ras Mengish's forces struck from the north, Ras Mikhail from the west, and the great encirclement Menelik had envisioned began to close like a fist. The Italians tried to form a defensive square, a tactic drilled from European wars, but the Ethiopian wave was too vast, too determined. Horses screamed, guns jammed, and standards fell. In one valley, the Italian artillery managed a few last volleys before being overrun. Rasulullah's men captured the cannons and turned them back on the invaders. For the first time in modern history, a European army, armed with steel, science, and empire, was being broken by an African empire armed with unity, courage, and an unshakable belief in its sovereignty. As the noon sun burned overhead, General Barateri stood on a ridge, staring down at the smoke-shrouded valleys. His field glasses trembled in his hands. Below him, the proud brigades of Italy were dissolving into silence. He whispered, perhaps to no one in particular, "We are finished." But Ethiopia's story was not finished, not yet. What came after would echo across continents, from Harlem to Moscow, from Addis Ababa to Rome itself. The turning tide by early afternoon, the battlefield of Adwa was no longer a clash, it was a reckoning. The highland wind carried dust, smoke, and prayers. Drums beat like thunder through the valleys. To the Italians still standing, The sound was haunting. It meant the Ethiopians were advancing again. To the Ethiopians, it was sacred rhythm, the heart of a free nation. General Baratieri's headquarters was in disarray. His officers shouted conflicting orders, telegraph operators had fled, and the lines of retreat were already clogged with the wounded. He had gambled on surprise, on precision, but Menelik had countered with something far greater, overwhelming coordination. The Ethiopian generals had fought, not as separate chiefs, but as organs of one living body. On the central ridge, Ras Makhonen, father of the future emperor Haile Selassie, commanded with icy composure. His riflemen were veterans of the war against the Mahdists, disciplined and fearless. "Hold your ground," he shouted. "Let no invader leave alive." Beside him, messengers relayed positions to Rasulullah, who was driving the Italians from the northern slopes, and to Ras Mengesha, who closed the ring from the west. The encirclement was almost complete. The Italians tried to regroup at Mount Bila. General Debramida, one of the last still commanding coherent units, formed a defensive line among the rocks. The men fixed bayonets, their faces gray with exhaustion. "We die here," Debramida told them. The Ethiopians stormed the ridge in waves, first riflemen, then cavalry, then sword-bearing warriors shouting Menelik II, Ethiopia. The melee lasted only minutes. When it ended, the Italian flag lay trampled, and Debramida was dead. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, Empress Tetu led the final push. She rode on a mule draped in white, her presence commanding instant respect. "Advance, do not let them escape," she cried. Her soldiers surged forward with renewed fury. Italian officers, stunned at the sight of a woman leading thousands of men into battle, realized too late that this was not a tribal war. It was a national defense led by both king and queen. By 2 p.m., the Italian army had collapsed. Entire regiments threw down their rifles, retreating in broken formations. Many of the colonial askari, Eritrean soldiers conscripted by Italy, surrendered to Menelik's forces, begging for mercy. Menelik ordered his men to spare them. "They are our brothers, not our enemies." It was a statement that revealed not just power, but humanity, the kind of mercy Europe had rarely shown Africa. General Baratieri fled the field under escort, his uniform torn, his horse limping. When he looked back from a distant ridge, the valley below was a moving sea of banners, green, red, and gold, and the Lion of Judah rising over captured artillery. The noise of battle had turned to a low murmur of victory songs. By evening, as the sun sank over Adwa, tens of thousands of Ethiopian warriors knelt in prayer. Priests raised crosses over the wounded and chanted hymns of thanksgiving. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and blood, but above it all was the unmistakable scent of freedom. For the first time in centuries, an African nation had defeated a European power on the battlefield. When the Italian dead were counted, the empire was forced to confront a brutal arithmetic: over 7,000 killed, 1,500 wounded, and 2,000 captured, including many senior officers. Ethiopia's losses were heavy too, but their victory was absolute. The next morning, Menelik rode through the valley of Adwa. Soldiers knelt as he passed, chanting, "Long live the King of Kings." He dismounted, bowed his head, and said quietly, "Today, Ethiopia stands." Across the Red Sea, the news hit Italy like a thunderclap. The Prime Minister in Rome resigned within days. Newspapers called it the humiliation of Adwa, but across Africa, and across the black diaspora in America and the Caribbean, the word Adwa became something else, a symbol, a spark. It whispered to colonized nations that empire was not invincible, that African unity could defeat European arrogance, and that dignity, once defended, could never again be taken without a fight. When the world learned the name Adwa, March 2, 1896, dawn broke over the highlands of northern Ethiopia with a silence that felt unreal. The smoke had drifted away. The moans of the wounded were all that remained. Crows circled over the ridges where the Italian army had once stood proud. What had begun as a campaign of conquest ended as a pilgrimage of humiliation. Emperor Menelik II rode once more onto the blood-soaked plain, flanked by Ras Makhonen and Rasulullah. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and dust. Menelik dismounted, removed his hat, and crossed himself. "Let the world see," he said quietly, "that Ethiopia bows to no one." Messengers galloped in all directions, north to the frontiers, south to Addis Ababa, and east to horror. Carrying the same words, the Italians are defeated. Adwa is ours. Within days, the news spread beyond the mountains and across the seas. In Rome, crowds gathered in disbelief outside Parliament. Impossible, they cried, but it was not only possible, it was undeniable. Italy's dream of empire had shattered. The government fell within the week. General Baratieri, once hailed as the conqueror of Africa, faced a court-martial. Newspapers in Europe printed the story reluctantly, their headlines trembling with shock. "Savages defeat civilization," read one French paper. "An African king humbles Europe," wrote another. Yet, beneath the condescension was fear. The fear that the myth of white invincibility had just been broken. Across Africa, the reaction was electric. From the shores of Ghana to the deserts of Sudan, people whispered the name Menelik. The victory at Adwa became a secret password of pride. In colonized lands, where hope had long been chained, men and women began to dream again. In the Caribbean, Pan-African thinkers like Henry Sylvester Williams and Marcus Garvey would later point to Adwa as proof that black sovereignty was not fantasy, but fact. In Harlem, newspapers hailed Menelik II as the Black Emperor who made Europe kneel. In Moscow, even Lenin would later cite Adwa as the moment that shattered imperial arrogance. For Ethiopia itself, the victory was more than a battle won, it was survival. Menelik leveraged the triumph into diplomacy, forcing Italy to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa in October 1896. The treaty recognized Ethiopia's full independence and nullified the false claims of protectorate status that had sparked the war. For the first time, an African nation had not only resisted colonization, it had dictated terms to Europe. Menelik used that victory wisely. He built telegraph lines, modern schools, and railroads. He sent ambassadors abroad. He imported technology from France and Britain, not as a dependent, but as an equal. And when European envoys arrived in Addis Ababa after Adwa, they came not as masters, but as guests. Empress Tetu, too, left her mark. Her courage at Adwa inspired Ethiopian women for generations. She later founded the city of Addis Ababa itself and became one of the most powerful queens in African history, a living reminder that Adwa had not been won by men alone. But beyond Ethiopia's borders, Adwa planted a deeper seed, one that would take decades to bloom. When colonial subjects from Nigeria to Kenya later rose up against imperial rule, they invoked Adwa. When black soldiers fought in World War II, they carried that same pride in their hearts. And when Haile Selassie, Menelik's successor, addressed the League of Nations in 1936 after Italy's second invasion, he reminded the world, "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." Those words echoed the spirit of Adwa, the eternal warning that no empire stands forever. Even now, the town of Adwa stands quiet under the Ethiopian sun. The rocks still hold traces of iron and memory. Every year, Ethiopians gather there are men, women, and children, waving flags of green, yellow, and red. They sing the songs their ancestors sang that day, voices rising into the same wind that once carried the sound of battle. And if you stand there long enough, you can almost hear it, the distant cry of warriors, the thunder of hooves, the drums of defiance, and the whisper of a king who kept his promise to his people. Ethiopia shall never be colonized. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.